development, the use of violence in sexual and romantic relationships, and understanding how culture and social norms affect identity development during adolescence. She uses this research to better inform and strengthen sexual and relationship education in different settings, including high schools and colleges, along with promoting public scholarship in non-academic communities. And Dr. Anders currently serves as the Society for the Study of Emerging Adulthood Communications Chair and Sexuality Topic Network Emerging Scholar Co-Chair. So without further ado, Dr. Anders, please take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and I'm very excited to be here. So I will go ahead and share my screen so that we can get this go. All right, hopefully everybody can see this. Yeah, there we go. Great, everyone can see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so thank you again for having me. I'm really excited to talk a bit about some of the research I have done related to this really incredibly important topic of sexual violence. And then I also will get into a bit about violence within romantic relationships, specifically teen dating violence. So I first wanted to get it working. I first wanted to recognize that we need to continue recognizing violence is occurring in our society. I'm going to talk mainly about U.S. populations and rates of violence within the U.S., but we need to recognize this is something that's happening around the world. It is consistent, it's prevalent, it's a real problem within our larger society. We do have certain months that kind of recognize different forms of violence within our society. So February is Teen Dating Awareness Month. Teen Dating Awareness Month, oh my goodness. Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. I don't know that we need to be aware that teens are dating. We kind of already know that. But so that should say Teen Dating Violence Awareness Month. April, or this month, is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And then October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I feel really honored to get to talk about this topic within April, and really hoping to continue bringing recognition to that sexual violence and sexual assault is happening, and we need to continue addressing it in our society. So I really want to start out first with what is sexual violence. It's important that we continue naming what it is and really developing a better understanding of that. And that starts with really how we define it and how we share these definitions related to it. So so this definition is based off of the NSVRC. And so it is not exhaustive, but it is a great comprehensive look at to what sexual violence even is. So I'm not going to read these out to you. It is a spectrum of violence ranging from rape or sexual assault all the way to just really kind of any non-consensual sexual activity. Something that's really recently been recognized and continuing to be integrated into how we look at sexual violence is the use of image sharing, including increases in like AI generation of images. That's out of the spectrum of what I'm going to talk about, but that is a really important area of sexual violence that's continuing to grow and needing to be recognized within sexual violence work and really what that looks like. So many of you all have probably heard the larger statistics that 1 in 5 women will experience sexual assault in their lifetime. So 1 in 5 women, which is a significant amount. And that's focusing solely on those who experience sexual assault or what's considered more of rape. For men, we're looking at closer to, for contact sexual violence, we're looking about 1 in 4, and so around 25%. When we consider kind of any form of sexual violence, which we'll kind of look at numbers for, that number is even higher. It's closer to 1 in 2 or 1 in 3. So we see this as extremely prevalent and really kind of a huge issue and continues to be in our society. And I wish I could say that the numbers were decreasing, but in fact, they are continuing to stay steady and or even rise in numbers. So what does this look like for teens and emerging adults? So the focus of my conversation today and really sharing research is focusing on the teen and emerging adult period. If you're not familiar with the term emerging adult, that's thinking between the ages of 18 to 29. Specifically, I'm going to hone in on college emerging adults, as this is a big area of kind of concern, and we're seeing a lot of high rates. So I'll talk about that. So just sharing some more rates of what this looks like based off the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. We do see that upwards of 13% of teens report that they have been ever forced to have sex. For female identifying, and for male identifying, that's 4%. We used to also have those who identified outside of female and male, but with current changes in what's being allowed to be presented, we no longer have those statistics to share, but I did want to go ahead and point that out, that we're seeing really high rates among those who are female and male identifying. When we are getting into sexual and gender identity, we can see really kind of big discrepancies as well, where many youth who fall within the LGBTQ+ spectrum do report significantly higher rates. And then we can also see some racial disparities within these rates as well too, with many multiracial individuals reporting higher rates of sexual violence. And then another demographic, really kind of demographic information showing sexual violence by anyone. We do see that this is kind of even higher. So if it's moving on sexual assault, we see these rates are even higher. So I really want to recognize that female identifying individuals, it is again, as teens, is close to 1 in 5. And then for LGBTQ+ youth, it is 1 in 5. Also, I wanted to share a graphic related to what this looks like as far as those who the age of first sexual assault. So we do see that close to half of individuals who are sexually assaulted, that will occur when they're 17 and younger, with the vast majority between the ages of 24 and younger. So we do see that this is a significant occurrence in the teen and emerging adult populations. And we do see that it is onset early for both female identifying and male identifying. So what do the rates look like for sexual violence in college? So we do have research based on the AAU climate survey and has shown that since enrolling in college, and so that's a really important distinction, since enrolling in college, that upwards of 26% of females will experience non-consensual sexual contact by either physical force or through the inability to consent since they started college. So 1 in 4, approximately. For at the undergrad level, at the graduate level, we're seeing about 1 in 10. When it comes to males, it's around 7%. I want to recognize that across all of these identities, it is highly underreported. So you can imagine these numbers are probably even higher, but we do see that often so males will often even more underreport. And then for those who are transgender, queer, or non-binary, we do see these rates are high, and I want to recognize that at the graduate level as well. So generally, we're continuing to see high rates of sexual violence during the teen and emerging adult years. So I know the focus today is largely on sexual violence, but I also really want to speak to relationship violence for a couple different reasons. One, this is an incredibly prevalent form of violence that's happening in our society, and we can't really fully separate sexual violence from relationship violence. They are very intertwined. They often go hand in hand, and it is something that is starting earlier and starting with many youth. And so we should recognize and speak to that as well. So I will kind of be presenting on both and talking also speaking to sexual violence within dating relationships as well. So what is relationship violence? I'm not going to go through this whole list, but I do want to recognize that within the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which is highly recognized by the CDC, we do see this includes 4 main types. This, again, very importantly, is a non-exhaustive list. There are many forms of relationship violence that do occur that aren't included in here. So anything ranging from reproductive control or reproductive coercion, financial abuse, lots of different forms. But these are some of the main ones that are kind of recognized and that are, what's the word I'm looking for? There's data collected on them. So we're going to kind of briefly look at those here. So when looking at lifetime prevalence rates going into adulthood, we do see that close to half of women report experiencing some form of relationship violence in their lifetime. So close to half. We do see with contact sexual violence, it's close to 20%, so aligning with that 1 in 5 number. And then you can see stalking and physical violence, so highly prevalent. We're also seeing really high rates for men, people identifying as males as well, with, again, also close to half of them, so about 45%. And you can see a little bit lower rates with sexual violence, but we do see very similar rates and slightly higher when it comes to physical violence. So this is happening for men and women, and it is something extremely prevalent and affects a large, half of our society, for those who are even. So what do rates of this dating violence look like for teens? So first of all, I want to apologize for this chart. I am not chart savvy. I'm telling you, I spent some time really trying to parse this out more and ended up yelling some words and gave up on it. So you're seeing a large graphic, but hopefully it gets the point across of showing how prevalent that teen dating violence is. So these are reports from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and we do see that many female identifying individuals are reporting that they're experiencing teen dating violence at least once, but in their youth, with upwards close to 20%. And then you can see the breakdown with physical and sexual. So we are actually seeing higher rates of sexual violence for within teen dating violence. And so that's important and something that I will speak to a bit. You can see the numbers for males as well. I want to highly recognize that there are disparities when it comes to based on race. Again, we do see some of the highest rates for those who identify as multiracial, but then it's important to recognize that there are disparities when it comes to Indigenous people, and we are seeing high rates of dating violence within those populations. And then for youth who are LGBTQ plus or queer youth, we are seeing highly disproportionate rates. Particularly if you notice for those who are bisexual and or other, so maybe they're still figuring out what they are, something that doesn't fall within this categories, we are seeing some of the highest rates of violence. So it's not enough to say that it looks really simple. It doesn't. It is affecting different populations and subpopulations differently, and we need to recognize that and continue to make sure to support those who are experiencing these disparities and recognizing that, rather than ignoring or pretending like this is not happening to certain groups of people. Okay, so what's so unique about adolescence and emerging adulthood where A, this is something that's happening, and or B, why we're really seeing this as an important time to address this? So adolescence and emerging adulthood are unique in general because hopefully you've taken a basic psychology class and this is a really big time of identity development. So this is a time where a lot of youth are figuring out who they are. They're trying on different hats. They're trying on different identities. They're really exploring and figuring out who they are. And that can be in the realm of romantic relationships and sexuality and who they're hanging out with, all of those different pieces. And so part of that exploration and this exploration we're hoping they're doing is that they are trying new things or they're getting exposed to new things, which may make them increasingly vulnerable to violence or to negative exposures. And so it's a really time of, because they are trying in new things and really developing these identities, they're also in a lot of transitions and a lot of maybe like uncertainty, or they've never been exposed to something before, so they don't know how to act, and or they don't know what are healthy or unhealthy interactions. And that includes in the areas of romantic and sexual exploration. So this is a really crucial time of really figuring out who they are as sexual people and also as partners. Many of them are starting to now actually enact dating relationships and starting to get into them, and really often looking to their parents or peers as models for what they should or shouldn't be doing. and really trying to explore and figure out what is normal and what's not. And then part of that also too, and particularly for emerging adulthood, is this kind of transition into college, which is this whole new entity, right? This whole new thing. It's very different than living with parents or caregivers and having set rules. There's all these new cultures and norms. We've heard many people talk to certain cultures like drinking cultures or casual sex cultures, right? There's a lot of different new norms that they're having to learn to navigate. And that can be potentially risky or increase their risk of experiencing violence. There's also often less social support when they're in college, and there's a lot less kind of like protections in place as they're really navigating becoming adults and really finding themselves in it. So this is a really unique period due to this identity development, also to this starting to date and explore sexuality and all of those pieces. And then these transition into college where there's potentially a higher risk cultures or norms that may increase these risks or this potential negative outcomes of violence. Okay, so to talk about myself, so I didn't start out wanting to study sexual violence. I found it extremely intimidating and scary. This is not an area I was directly going into, but it's an area that I kept finding myself in over and over again. So I started out really interested in understanding sexual development of college students, really looking into hooking up related behaviors. I was really interested in understanding sexual possible selves, or basically sexual identities that you hold for yourself. And what I found was over and over again, sexual violence among college students kept finding this research. So we couldn't talk about sexuality and sexual development without talking about sexual violence. So I gave some examples on this slide of different areas that, again, not the aim, but we kept seeing these kind of themes related to sexual assault and sexual violence coming up over and over again without even trying. So for example, with sexual possible selves, this idea of really looking at their feared selves or the selves that they hope to become in the future sexually and hope to avoid being in the future. Over and over again, we saw both men and women talking about these fears around becoming someone who was sexually assaulted or sexually assaulted someone else. And so even without asking for it, that was very prevalent in their mind and was a really important part of something they really feared for the future, particularly while in college. So many of them saying that they were concerned that they didn't want to go to a party and something happening, and that's then who they became. This is probably not shocking, but within the hooking up literature, this came up over and over again. So I've done quite a bit of work related to hooking up. And for one example, one study looking at the costs and benefits of why individuals choose to hook up, one of the significant costs that came up was this idea of sexual violence through hooking up. So it was identified as one of the potential negatives or costs of it, but it was just widely accepted that was just the risk, that if you wanted to engage in hookup behaviors, you were just going to have to take that risk. So I did include an example quote here of a couple male identifying college students talking about, without even meaning to, specifically describing sexual violence against others. So please read that with caution. It is quite triggering. It was triggering to do the research and hearing it, let alone having to read about it. But we did see that this was kind of highly ingrained without them even intentionally trying to. We also saw this come up significantly within parent, adolescent, parent, emerging adult sexual communication. So some of the most frequent messages that teens and emerging adults were receiving about sex was avoid sexual assault. That was really kind of the most prevalent messaging they were getting. And it was the consistent, rather than receiving any kind of comprehensive sex ed, it was just, hey, make sure to protect yourself when it comes to sexual violence, right? Over and over again. And then interesting, even when we intentionally asked participants to not describe sexual violence, it still came up. So when we did a study related to how college students describe what bad sex is and intentionally said not to focus on acts of sexual violence, it still came out. Around 15% of our sample talked about things that they said they didn't even recognize was sexual violence. So they just considered it bad sex And we said, when reviewing their qualitative responses, we said, actually, you're describing sexual violence, right? So they thought it was just normal bad sex when really it was violent behaviors. So really what we're seeing here is that sexual violence, unfortunately, continues to be highly ingrained in sexuality. It is something that is unfortunately has become a almost normative part of development, in the sense that we have to continue addressing it because it's not normal. And yet it is kind of just been integrated as a part of, like, unfortunately, this is college, right? So it is something that has now driven that this is a focus area of mine, and particularly better understanding what's really contributing to these rates of sexual violence and why individuals are experiencing sexual violence and dating violence throughout their teen and emerging adult years. So this leads into what I'm really going to heavily talk about today, which is focusing on what factors increase the risk of sexual violence and relationship violence during adolescence and emerging adulthood. So this is a big area, and you'll see that particularly because I'm going to share some of our results, but it's an area that we found to be really important. We're seeing these prevalence rates, and I would argue that we are working really hard to decrease them, but we really need to fully understand what is really contributing to them. So our solution, because when we started digging into this literature, was to find, well, there's a lot. There is a lot of research related to this. There is a lot of risk factors that are being identified, or even potential risk factors, and all of those different pieces. So our first kind of thought or step of action was, well, what we need to do is take this research and then do a series of meta-analyses so we can synthesize and consolidate and look a bit more at what is really significantly related, or a significant risk marker related to sexual assault, and also for teen dating violence. So we did this through 2 different meta-analyses series. Really quickly, if you're not familiar with meta-analyses, that's okay. A few years ago, I wasn't either, so I'll just give the very brief description. The idea with a meta-analysis is that you recognize that there's a multitude of research, particularly quantitative research or data, that's looked at a topic area and looked at similar outcomes. And then what you do is create kind of consolidated or synthesized averages of that data. So then you can have it more in one place and both look at what variables, in this case, risk factors for sexual violence or teen dating violence, but what variables are kind of really consistently showing up within the topic area, and then also which of these have kind of stronger relationships with the outcome variables. So it really allows you to consolidate research and to really identify what is being consistently, or what is consistently showing as having a relationship with your outcome variable. And so that is what we did within sexual assault literature, or college sexual assault literature, and teen dating violence. This is ongoing, so we should have a couple additional meta-analyses coming out related to this topic, but I want to speak to ones that have already been previously published and talk to those. And then I'm going to talk about an unpublished one related to sexual violence in teen dating violence, sexual violence in teen dating violence, but I will get to that. So as you can see here, these are some of the areas, including victimization, perpetration, a specific study related to mental health factors. And then for teen dating violence, same idea, but then with this one, we were really interested in family-specific factors. So family of origin, to understand some of these generational things that are being passed down. So when navigating all of this data that I'm going to present, but then also just generally what risk factors look like with sexual violence and teen dating violence, I really wanted to present this and approach this through the CDC social ecological model. So this model is really a framework to better understand violence and really focused on areas for prevention. So if we can identify these kind of different, where these risk factors are in these different levels, then we can more directly create prevention efforts to them, and also highlight gaps in our understanding at each of these levels. Because this framework really argues that it's not just one level. It's not just individual level factors or societal level factors, right? It's all of them that are contributing to these negative outcomes, in this case, violence. And then importantly, each of these systems really interact with each other to increase or decrease risk. And so we have to A, both recognize that, and then B, look at how these are interrelated so that we can then more effectively address them. So I'm going to, rather than going meta-analysis by meta-analysis, I'm going to actually speak to risk factors that we found at each of these levels and really look at it for both sexual violence and for teen dating violence. Okay, so I want to start with the individual level. So this is really kind of more biological or personal history factors that do increase risk. Now, if you are looking at these charts of variables and you're like, holy moly, this is overwhelming, I promise you, we also were overwhelmed seeing it. So when we initially conducted these meta-analyses, for the sexual violence one, our initial kind of looking through the literature, we came up with over 6,000 different articles specific to sexual violence in college. Now, not all of them can be used. You can see from our handy dandy flow chart that we had to cut out quite a bit of them. But in general, we did see that there's been a good amount of research done on this and that many people have looked at risk factors related to it. So there are a lot of risk factors listed. There are also a lot of risk factors that are not listed. Part of a meta-analysis is also that you have to only include research that has looked at direct bivariate relationships. So, ones that have looked at the direct link between A and B. If there's other confounding factors integrated in there, then you're not able to necessarily include them in the meta-analysis because you don't know if you're capturing a direct relationship or some other factors. So that is important to recognize. However, even from the ones that we were able to use, we did get a significant amount of risk factors. And these are, so I promise I'm going to do some consolidation of this and really point at some of the big things to focus on from each of these different levels. So at the individual level, when it comes to sexual violence, we did see that across both victimization, which is this chart that's kind of on the left, and perpetration, which is the chart on the right, we did see that consistently the strongest risk factor or strongest relationship we did see was related to a history of violence. So this is probably not new news and also continues to be really emphasized that previous experiences with violence, whether it be sexual violence or even intimate partner violence in this case, we do see that these are highly related to future re-victimization. So there is a lot to be said that many individuals, many youth who experience violence early in their development, whether it's childhood or maybe during their teen years or emerging adulthood, they are kind of more highly likely to experience it later in life as well. And so this really points to important points of prevention because we need to do more to support survivors to better make sure that there isn't increased risks of re-victimization. There is some research that shows upwards of 50% of individuals who experience violence when they're younger will experience it again at least once in their life. So really high numbers related to that. Importantly, we do see that, again, just kind of to point to this, that when it comes to sexual violence, it's not just sexual violence experiences that are associated with increased risk, but also experiences of interpersonal violence or dating violence that also are highly related as well and really point to polyvictimization, that many individuals will experience multiple forms of violence. So I'm going to speak to childhood abuse here, but I also will speak to it in a second when we come to relationship factors, because that ties in a lot with family level. But I do want to point out that we are seeing that childhood sexual abuse and childhood abuse are significantly related to later experiences of sexual violence while in college or among college students as well, too. So importantly, I also want to speak to personal beliefs and attitudes. So this was a big area, particularly when it came to perpetration. And our research was really confirming that attitudes and personal beliefs were incredibly important or incredibly related to experiences of sexual violence, particularly perpetration. So we did find that higher rape myths, beliefs, and acceptance, or the idea that they're accepting of kind of rape behaviors or rape beliefs, and or that they have higher levels of like beliefs and myths around rape, they were more likely, this was associated with increased risk of perpetrating sexual violence. And then we also saw that some kind of attitudes related to like gender beliefs and different levels of sexist beliefs and hostility towards women were also significantly related to increased risk of perpetration as well too. And I do want to recognize that these were considered kind of medium effect sizes, or the idea that it's not just as like slightly related, that there's a pretty significant association between these kind of personal beliefs and likelihood of perpetration. And then we also saw that perception of sexual assault risk was significantly related to victimization. So not less about perpetration, but more of victimization when it came to, so those who saw that there was increased risk, either they were recognizing based on their experiences, they were recognizing it happened, or it was, how do I want to say this? Maybe I'll backtrack from that. But in general, what we did find was that just kind of this higher perception that what was happening was actually positively related to their risk of victimization, which really points to it's not just about education, but instead we also need to move just beyond like knowledge around it, and instead that we need to focus on like efficacy and or other type like behavioral changes rather than just knowledge around sexual assault risk and violence. Okay, continuing with this, so we did see that mental and psychological health was significantly related to victimization. So we conducted a specific study focused on mental health factors and substance use factors for both victimization and perpetration. And there was a lot of significance, as you can see from this chart. So we overarchingly did find that there were a lot of mental health or psychological concerns related to victimization, and then a lot of substance use related to both victimization and perpetration. So importantly, because this is very important, I want to recognize that we can't really point to causality. So the vast majority of these studies are cross-sectional, right? So all we can speak to is associations. So we don't know necessarily if these variables are predicting or what's the word I'm looking for, or what's leading to victimization or perpetration, but instead we don't know if it's an antecedent or if we know it's an outcome. We just know it's related and should be recognized. So generally, we are seeing some mental health concerns around anxiety, depressive symptoms, and then getting into concerns around self-harm, ranging from hopelessness to suicide ideation. So these are all kind of medium effects or medium to small relationships. Now, with substance use and abuse, this is probably not surprising. We cannot and often don't talk about sexual violence without talking about substances, right? Particularly just overarchingly, but at the college level, there is a lot of research that has shown relationships. Now, does that mean that anybody who uses drugs or alcohol are going to perpetrate or become victims of sexual violence? No, that's not how it works. But there is this consistent relationship that we do see. Now, does that also mean that those who are survivors and it occurred while they were under the influence, do they deserve that? Absolutely not, period. There's no questioning of that. The worst that someone deserves after using alcohol is a hangover or whatever. No one deserves sexual violence. However, we also need to recognize that there is an association, and that is showing up across studies. So these meta-analyses are consistently showing there is a relationship between substance use and abuse and both victimization and perpetration, and you can see that here. All right, so individual factors when it comes to teen dating violence, we do see that, again, if this looks very familiar, it's because it is similar. And this is why we want to speak to both sexual violence and dating violence, because there is a lot of overlapping, right? We've already spoken to that there's this like polyvictimization that often occurs. And also we need to continue recognizing that there are overlapping risk factors, so some individuals may be at higher risk of experiencing multiple forms of violence. So we do see that, again, a history of violence is strongly related to increased risk of both victimization and perpetration. So that goes across. So importantly, something that we recognize within teen relationships is there are higher experiences of, wow, I'm blanking on the word. During the teen years, there may be violence against each other within the relationship. So we see that kind of decreasing when it comes into adulthood, where it's often more of like a power and control. So there's less of perpetration against each other. But there has been research that's shown during the teen years that there may be increased risk of mutual perpetration. And so we are kind of seeing some of that coming out here as well. But generally, we are seeing that. So a great example of that is there's a high risk of, there is a really strong association of perpetration of physical dating violence with the prevalence of being a physical dating violence victim as well too. So we are seeing this potential mutual violence that is occurring a bit more within the teen years. But in general, we are seeing that there's this kind of polyvictimization coming out again that is very consistently. I mean, these are now reaching into really strong effects where there are really kind of strong relationships between these variables. Again, I want to speak to childhood. We do see experiences of childhood abuse are related to both victimization and perpetration, which highly aligns with this idea that many individuals who perpetrate violence are often ones who've experienced it. And so they learn these violent behaviors. A lot of violence is socially learned, and it's often due to experiences or socialization that many of them receive from their family of origins and or potentially peers, which I'll speak to in a second, but peers who are really shaping, as they're going through this teen years and learning how to be in relationships, this is where they're really learning what it looks like, and many are referring back to what they were exposed to or what their peers are doing. So that's incredibly important. Again, when it comes to personal beliefs and attitudes for teen dating violence, we do see that, so there's a little bit less of an effect, but we do see that those who approve more of violence or have higher rates of approval of violence are more likely to actually perpetrate teen dating violence. So that's important that it's related to perpetration. Similarly, again, mental and psychological health, we did see that there were a high number of externalizing behaviors and even just a broad category of externalizing behaviors was highly related to the both victimization and to perpetration. Again, anxiety, depressive symptoms, and suicide were all highly related, more so with victimization than with perpetration. Now, substance use and abuse came up again. In fact, that was a highly recognized, and you can see a large effect size when it comes to substance use with victimization. Again, I don't want anybody to take this and say, oh, well, they were engaging in substances, and so that's what they get or whatever. That's not how that works. Instead, what we just tend to see is that can be used as either a catalyst for excuses to perpetrate violence against someone, and or that there may be a little bit more risk that when you are under substances, that violence may occur. And also the recognition that in general, substance use during your teen years is technically illegal. And so they may be engaging in higher risk behaviors in general, which could be associated with increased risk of violence as well. Okay, so moving on from individual factors, we're going to speak a bit to relationship factors, particularly starting off with sexual violence. So relationship factors are really looking at close relationships and relationship dynamics that increase or decrease risk. So this is probably not surprising, but teens and emerging adults are really highly focused on their friends, right? Peers are incredibly important. It's part of development. It's just part of how the US society is very focused on these social aspects. And so we did specifically identify and look at some factors related to sexual violence when it came to peers. Unfortunately, just not a lot came up. So we historically, previous research has really pointed and found a lot of support that negative peer support, that's very important, it's different. So that really negative peer support or support that encourages violence, that encourages negative behaviors, all of those pieces, that's often highly related with peer impacts on the likelihood of engaging in sexual violence. And we didn't necessarily find that here, which was a little bit surprising, but I want to recognize that. However, we did find that I'll point to this here, a pretty strong effect size or relationship between peers' approval of sexual violence and the actual engagement in sexual violence. And so specifically, when it came to perpetration, we did find, and I don't have the chart on here simply because that was the only one we found, but we did find that when peers were reporting more approval of sexual assault, there was a medium effect, but a significant effect that was found where that increased the likelihood or was associated with an increased likelihood of perpetrating sexual violence while in college. So peers' approval matters. Peer support, peers' socialization, that was showing up. Interestingly, we often will see that social support is a protective factor, but that was not found within our meta-analysis. So there's not in the research that we were able to include, that was not a consistent or a significant finding. Relationship status was also not a protective factor, but we did find this really interesting result with hooking up, where we did see a significant relationship between hooking up behaviors and with the increased likely of perpetrating violence in particular. So peers do matter in these kind of, and I'll speak to these norms in a second, but peers do matter, particularly based on approval or support of it. Now, parents, so I'm going to come back to this again, childhood abuse, because we can't, so this is the point of this framework, is that we cannot necessarily separate them out, but we did see that experiences of childhood abuse were significantly related to the experiences of sexual violence victimization and perpetration. So what they are learning from their parents is having important socialization and factors on both like taking in these behaviors and or the potential risk of sexual violence victimization, but also many of them, because they experienced abuse and kind of learned it as a quote unquote normative, then they are more likely to perpetrate as well. All right, so when it comes to teen dating violence in relationships, we found a lot. So you can see all these highlights, but in general, there was a really significant relation in general with that peers played an important role on teen dating violence factors. So in particular, we saw a significant relationship that peers who were perpetrating teen dating violence, that was highly related with increased risk of the individual perpetrating teen dating violence. So there's this really kind of interesting study that came out looking at, is it that birds of a feather kind of flock together, so people with similar peers with similar like beliefs around dating violence kind of hang out together, or is it about that they're socializing each other? And what was found was kind of both. So there's a little bit of that increased exposure to this is going to increase your likelihood of you doing it. So if peers were perpetrating violence, then they were also more likely to then start integrating that into their dating patterns. And also we saw that those who kind of were at increased risk of perpetrating violence were also more likely to spend time with others who had similar behaviors and kind of beliefs. We also saw polyvictimization, so experiencing cyberbullying was also associated with increased risk of experiencing teen dating violence victimization and also with perpetration. So generally, we also did a study specifically looking at family of origin factors, where we looked at what family factors were most highly related to both victimization and perpetration. You can see this in this chart down here. And what we found was, first of all, there weren't as many family of origin factors that have been kind of consistently identified in the research in general, which is a problem. We need to better understand what these family of origin factors look like. But what we did see that there was a consistent relationship, that abuse came up again, that poor parenting, so like poor parenting, socialization, and that witnessing interparental violence were all significantly related to victimization, and then also to perpetration. So what this means is that many individuals are really internalizing what is kind of happening within their family of origin, and often, since that is where they look to as role models for their sexual and romantic relationships, many of them are kind of internalizing that and integrating it into their own relationships. All right, so looking at community factors, I'm going to only speak to sexual violence because sadly, we did not really find any community level factors related to teen dating violence. So from this, we did see that college settings and communities had a relationship with sexual violence risk and victimization and perpetration. Shockingly, the only one that was really found was Greek membership, but that went across both victimization and perpetration. So there is this association with that being part of a Greek or fraternity or sorority. There is an increased risk of sexual violence, victimization, and perpetration, which aligns with a lot of previous research that has shown that. Interestingly, though, athletic membership, which has been often consistently shown, was not significantly related when looking across different research. Now, importantly, I really want to highlight, and although these aren't not necessarily direct community focused risk factors, they are something that we should point out. So many of these risk factors that we found are fitting in with larger cultures related to college. So in particular, we have seen that there's this recognition and potentially pressure of engaging in drinking cultures while at college. And this aligns a lot with these risk factors related to substance use and binge drinking in particular. And so it's important to recognize that many of these this college cultures or college settings can be contributing to some of the higher risk factors that we're seeing, particularly when individuals are doing it as a way to fit in with the larger cultures on college campuses, or they're coming in ill-prepared to understand what these cultures look like, which then may be associated with increased risk around sexual violence. And then also casual sex norms as well. So it is highly recognized that it's not necessarily just about casual sex, but instead these norms that contribute to increased likelihood, these norms or cultures that increase people engaging in casual sex, even if they don't necessarily want to, but they want to fit in. And so this identification that hooking up was significantly related to sexual violence is a good pointing to that there may be something about these casual sex norms in particular that are increasing the risk related to it. So when it comes to societal level, none of the meta-analyses we have conducted have found enough measurable effects or significant effect sizes around societal level factors. We openly recognize that broad societal factors and norms are influencing our prevalence of violence, but we're not finding it specifically in the research. And so we need to both recognize that these kind of learned beliefs and behaviors around violence, so the acceptance of it, the rape myths are not coming from nowhere. They're integrated into our larger society and being socialized. And so that is pointing to where we need to really better understand this relationship and intervene with it, particularly thinking about even the prevalence of sexual relationship violence, how highly prevalent it is in our society. That's a societal level issue, and we need to more fully recognize that. Okay, so really quickly, just for the sake of time, I conducted a very directed study that looked at, or did a meta-analysis of looking at sexual violence in teen dating violence. I want to recognize this is an unpublished study, and you'll see why. So part of our biggest issue with conducting this research is there was just not enough to be able to really run analyses on it. So we were extremely surprised to find that a lot of the sexual violence within teen dating violence was grouped together with other forms of violence. So it wasn't that it was being examined on its own, but instead it was often being grouped with other forms of violence and not looking at risk factors unique to the actual use of sexual violence in teen dating violence. And so we, in general, find there was a really high exclusion rate due to this, of not even measuring sexual violence. So they focused maybe on physical or emotional violence and did not even look at sexual violence, and that there was kind of a lack of significance in general. So this really points to that, even though this is highly prevalent and that sexual violence is happening within teen dating violence, we're not necessarily doing enough directed research to really aimed at understanding that and really the uniqueness of what risk factors are associated or contributing to sexual violence in dating relationships. So if anybody's interested in doing more research, that is a gap that continues to need to be filled. Okay, so what now? So if you can take anything away from this discussion, the biggest takeaway is, please, in any quantitative research you do, include bivariate statistics, a correlation table, something in all of your research. This allows individuals who do meta-analysis or any kind of synthesizing research to be able to include it in their research and look at more directed relationships between variables. So if you're currently working on research, go ahead and stick a correlational table in there so we can just better understand this across research. But beyond that, we just, in general, need to better capture and examine sexual violence within teen dating relationships. So I just got at that with that previous study, and better looking at what are some unique risk markers for each type of violence. We can't necessarily say that it's all equally contributing to like physical and emotional, right? We need to understand uniquely, so what is associated with each type of violence, so then we can better do directed efforts at intervening. Additionally, we need more longitudinal research. The vast majority of violence research is correlational, and so we need to really continue better examining if these risk factors are more antecedents of violence or outcomes. And then we need to do more research specifically looking at community and societal level risk factors. As you saw from what I presented, those did not show up or were very rarely captured within both the sexual violence and the relationship violence research. So we do see for the applied work that points of intervention, we really need to focus on previous history of violence, as this is continually the strongest relationship with experiencing both sexual violence and teen dating violence. So directed efforts really need to continue working with survivors to better support them and decrease their potential risk of re-victimization and or perpetration of violence. We need to have more early prevention and intervention efforts, including multi-generational violence. These family of origin factors were highly contributing to it, things related to direct mental health, substance use abuse. And we need to continue addressing negative cultures and beliefs and attitudes. So whether that being the college cultures that are contributing to it or the acceptance or encouragement of violence, but in general, we need to continue directing our efforts at changing our cultures on campuses and or related to teens. So I just want to show my acknowledgements really quick. I'm grateful for my co-collaborators on all of this research, the department I come from at Kansas State. Importantly, we should always do this, but all the participants over all of the studies who have provided their experiences, voices, and valuable data. And then I would like to thank the InCHIP for allowing me to come and talk about some of this research, and then references, and then I will end there. So thank you.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Let's open it up for questions. So if folks have questions, please feel free to unmute and yeah, go ahead. Let's see. Do you have any questions in the chat? Okay, I guess I can start. Thanks for this talk because this is very, very well aligned with my own research. So I study intimate partner violence among sexual and gender minority men, so particularly among men, right? And one of the issues we found, and also aged 18 to 29, and I'm looking at the impact of IPV under the context of HIV prevention and STI prevention, and how mental health and substance use can mediate this association. I have actually that's two questions, but they're interconnected. The first is that you mentioned the role of college, especially the population that you study is among college students. I just wonder, like, what do you see the roles of campuses, organizations such as sexual health wellness center or LGBT health center, that in terms of promoting sexual violence awareness and also to increase access to help. And another question related to this is, so much of my work is online. So, to see how dating apps can be a venue that both increase the risk of violence as well as providing services. So I just wonder, like, from your work, are there any specific aspects in terms of how we can utilize online platform, the website, the internet as a ways to, address some of the issues that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's such a great question and such a generally good recognition of what this topic area, because it's so incredibly important. So first of all, I think we can't talk about this without talking and recognizing that funding related to these topics are, for lack of a better word, are kind of under attack. We are seeing intentional decreases in funding related to those who are sexual minority or queer individuals, including on college campuses. And that both points to how do I want to say this? It points to that already, even though we're seeing these disparities in rates among these populations, that colleges aren't doing, or larger funding agencies aren't doing enough to really recognize that and intervene, right? Where that's something that's not being prioritized. I can speak to our university, where although we have prevention specialists one prevention specialist who goes and educates around this topic, including bystander training, and may or may not do directed efforts towards those who are at higher disparities of it. This is something that oftentimes our funding is really quickly cut in this area, and or that is not being prioritized. And in fact, a lot of our funding is through grant funding that, again, may or not exist. So first, just wanting to recognize that it is a already changing environment of something that was already a huge deficit in like where we needed to be supporting. And I think it's also important to recognize that, for example, for many sexual minority individuals, they are seeking sexual relations outside of college campuses. Many of them will be using dating apps or other avenues. We see that within hooking up culture, right? That many queer individuals just say they actually seek hookup partners outside of the university because of being outed, because of all kinds of reasons, right? So I think you're exactly right that technology is the perfect place that we really do need to do more intervention efforts, because we may not be reaching them on college campuses when it doesn't necessarily feel like a safe space for them in general. And so I'm certainly not a tech expert. I have so much value, or I think there's so much value in people who do tech work and integrate it. But I think if we can speak to, if we can find ways to like subtly or not integrate that within tech, I think that's fantastic. Dating apps and all of that, because I don't although we should be doing it on the college level, that might not be the most wide-reaching area to support those who are queer or who may have historically or continually gender or sexual minority statuses. So That was a long-winded answer of saying, I support you and think you're recognizing something that's incredibly important. And I wish I had a specific answer on how to fix everything. But isn't that the goal of our research, right? Like, we're trying to fix everything because we want this to stop. I want my job. I want to not have to do this research anymore because it doesn't exist. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I also want to acknowledge that we're on time. So, folks may have questions but may not be able to ask you directly. Please feel free to email Dr. Anders. I'm sure they're welcome, to answer those questions. We do have one more question here in the chat. Can you speak a bit more about the funding of likelihood to repeat violence? And is there any recommendation in harm reduction strategies?
Yes. So, and this has been pretty consistently shown across research, not even these meta-analyses, just has come up over and over again of this when it comes to survivors, this re-victimization, just increased risk. That there's a lot of pointing to that it's not necessarily that they're like red flags for it or anything. Like, it's not something necessarily that they're doing, but there are a lot of oppressive things that they grew up in, or oppressive factors that then could contribute to their risk, or that maybe they're in communities that have more violence or something along those lines, or they've been what we often see as someone who does work in the family science field. What we see is that it's learned. So again, not their fault. That's really important. It is never the survivor's fault, right? But there may be learned things that then that can increase their risk, because without understanding it, there's unhealthy patterns that increase their risk. And so that's a lot of why we see some that contributes to this victimization. Will you repeat the second part of the question?
Is there any recommendation in harm reduction strategies?
Yes. Something that we can really point to, so I'm going to talk a little bit in my field about with the family science and kind of relationship, is that really we're not focusing only on those individual level factors, but instead working through some of these learned family level factors with risk reduction. That we shouldn't focus only on educating or prevention or risk reduction with the individual, but instead these other factors, including addressing some of these family of origin factors that they have either internalized or been socialized around or experienced. And so that should be a really directed aim, because I think if we only focus on the individual and the individual level factors, that's not going to efficiently decrease or stop this from happening. And so very, very important recognition of with risk reduction of that it needs to be pointed at all the levels, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you. Definitely don't want to cause additional harm to the victim. Yep, we have some responses in the chat as well. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you again, Dr. Anders. Yeah, please feel free to reach out to InCHIP or Dr. Anders directly if you have additional question, and we will have our next InCHIP lecture next month, I guess. And thank you, and have a lovely day.
Thank you. If you